In May of 2019, otherwise known as a previous life, I had the privilege of joining a couple dozen other Presbyterians on a 9-day journey to the Holy Land. There were a number of reasons why I really wanted to make this trip. There's my interest in the political situation and human rights conditions growing out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's the pull that I, like many Christians, feel to the place where our shared faith was born. And there's even my taste buds' delight in Middle Eastern cuisine. But also, I just really wanted to see and walk and feel the landscapes and streetscapes of Palestine and Israel. And that's what this presentation is about. When you visit a holy historic site, it can be hard to feel that you're really in the place where it happened. Sometimes that's because no one is sure that the event traditionally associated with that place actually happened there. And more often, it's because something, usually a church, has been built on top of it. Jacob's Well, for example, is in the basement of a Greek Orthodox church, as is the traditional site of the birth of Jesus. While you'd think a flying saucer had landed in the middle of the Galilean village of Capernaum, where Jesus began his ministry. But the land itself, while it has certainly been altered over the centuries, it lets you feel that you're seeing the same sights that people saw, traveled across, and lived in 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. So for the next little while, I'd like to take you on a photographic tour of some of the holy landscapes that I was fortunate enough to visit. Now, I've included streetscapes and cityscapes as well as natural features, the guiding principle being to show you some of the spaces between the famous and holy places, some of the sites that you won't find in the guidebooks. And so maybe the next time you pick up your Bible to read about the travels of Abraham and Sarah, or Jesus and his disciples, or to imagine the treacherous road from Jerusalem down to Jericho where the Good Samaritan came to the aid of a fellow traveler, well, maybe the images that I'm about to share will help the Bible stories come a bit more alive for you. When I was planning this presentation, I at first tried to come up with a snazzy way of organizing it that would have some biblical significance, following in the footsteps of Jesus or something like that. I soon realized that that would be more trouble than it was actually worth, and I might not finish putting the thing together until Christmas. So instead, I settled on organizing our video tour around my group's travel itinerary, which more or less took the shape of a flat tire moving clockwise. From Tel Aviv, Joppa in biblical times, on the Mediterranean coast, up the coastal plain to the Carmel Mountains, from which we turned east and headed to Nazareth and then into the Galilee region. Our next leg was south along the Jordan Valley, straight south to Jericho and the Dead Sea, and then turning west and up into the mountains toward Jerusalem. We spent some time in the Jerusalem and Bethlehem area before heading north for a little jog into the upper region of today's West Bank before heading back to the Mediterranean coast to Tel Aviv and the flight home. Our first look at holy landscapes, then, is the view from seat 27H LL Flight 2. Not much to see there. A few minutes later, the young woman in the window seat was kind enough to take a picture for me of our approach into Tel Aviv. Still, it doesn't quite give you the flavor of the place, does it? In fact, unless you enter Israel by land, nothing that you will see upon arrival, and probably for several hours afterward, will make you feel that you're following in the footsteps of Jesus. Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean coast is a shiny glass and steel metropolis. And really, the entire coastal plain of Israel is that part of the country that both looks the most like every other place on earth and that plays the smallest role in the Bible. This is because it's the most fertile and hospitable part of the region, and in biblical times it was usually occupied by people who were stronger than the Israelites, relegating God's people to the inland hill country, where life was harder but also a bit more secure. Case in point, our first stop after leaving the airport was at Caesarea Maritima, the site of a Roman city, port, and other fortifications built during the rule of Herod the Great. Caesarea was the capital of the Roman government in Palestine for 6 centuries, but it plays a relatively minor role in the Bible, mostly in the book of Acts, where Peter converts the Roman centurion Cornelius to Christianity, and where Paul stands trial in a Roman court. So it was after leaving Caesarea and turning inland that my group and I really began to feel the biblical weight on the landscape. Climbing into the Carmel Mountains, our plan was to visit the Carmelite monastery on the traditional site where the prophet Elijah conquered the priests of Baal, as described in 1 Kings chapter 18. This is known as the best view in all of the Holy Land. However, it happened that the monk in charge that day had closed the gates early and wasn't inclined to let us or anyone else in. Thus, our view consisted of the town of Dalyat al-Carmel, some olive trees, and a tantalizing sign telling us what we were missing. So it was on to Nazareth, the journey to which included a really long tunnel, the Yitzhak Rabin Tunnel, and a brief view of Mount Tabor, the leading candidate for the site of Jesus' transfiguration. Nazareth itself is a crowded and bustling place, an Arab city with the largest proportion of Arab Christians in Israel. This part of the holy landscape, then, is better described as a holy cityscape. That first day in Israel, yes, this has been only one day so far, it ended with a descent to the Sea of Galilee, which lies at roughly 700 feet below sea level, and our first night at the appropriately named Sea of Galilee Hotel. Lying on the northwest shore of the sea, it was a touristy place, but comfortable, with a nice pool and a view of the Golan Heights off to the east. The next day, we explored a number of places in the Galilee region. Cana, the town where, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus turned water into wine. The Mount of Beatitudes, the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount. Another, less spectacular hillside that some scholars think may have been the actual site of the Sermon on the Mount. The village of Capernaum, the beach where Jesus is said to have appeared to the disciples following his resurrection, and where he challenged Peter, "Feed my sheep." and of course the Sea of Galilee itself, with its views of the surrounding mountains and the city of Tiberias. When it was time to move on, we headed south on Highway 90, down the Jordan Valley. Though we could easily see across the valley into the country of Jordan, the river itself was mostly invisible and in fact mostly dry. Soon we crossed into the occupied West Bank, where we would spend much of the rest of our visit. Our final destination on this day was Bethlehem, but along the way we made a quick side trip into Jericho and had lunch at the Temptation Restaurant, so named because of the traditional association of Jesus' testing by the devil in the surrounding wilderness. It was a delightful and friendly place with great falafel, and highly recommended. From Jericho, it's up to Jerusalem, the highway following the route of the infamous and deadly road where Jesus said his story of the Good Samaritan. The trip is fairly easy these days, and unless on the way up your engine overheats or on the way down your brakes go out. Still, the landscape is forbidding and rugged. And of course, the journey still has its dangers. It was along here that we got our first look at the so-called separation barrier, the wall that the state of Israel has built and continues to build along what it considers to be the border between Israel and the occupied territories. Most of the next several days we spent exploring sites and meeting people in Bethlehem, East Jerusalem, and surrounding areas. As I've said, I'm trying to focus in this program not on historical and holy sites, the famous places, but on natural scenes, landscapes, and streetscapes that you won't find in most tourist guidebooks. The biggest disappointment of the trip happened on a return into the Jordan Valley. We were supposed to visit Masada, the massive and imposing Roman fortress built by Herod the Great that looms above the southern reaches of the Dead Sea. Thanks to a series of minor delays that added up into a major one, we arrived at Masada after closing time. However, we still got to travel through the Judean wilderness, worth the price of admission, and to float in the Dead Sea. Here are the pertinent numbers, by the way, for that trip to the Dead Sea. It lies roughly 1,400 feet below sea level, and the temperature on the day of our visit was 113 degrees Fahrenheit. As the end of our stay in the Holy Land approached, we headed north into the hill country of the region known in biblical times as Judea and Samaria, now part of the occupied West Bank. Our first visit was the Israeli settlement of Shiloh, roughly halfway between Ramallah and Nablus. The settlement of Shiloh surrounds the biblical site of Shiloh, where a boy named Samuel, who would become one of ancient Israel's greatest prophets, was serving in the sanctuary and received his call from God. Shiloh today is a beautiful and fascinating place, but it has also been turned into a bit of a biblical theme park, seemingly designed to appeal to evangelical Christians visiting from the U.S. Presentations to visitors, including not only a movie, but a holographic depiction of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, are part Bible study, part archaeology lesson, and part Israeli settlement propaganda. After leaving Shiloh, we continued north to Nablus, a dramatically beautiful city that is home both to Jacob's Well and the Balata refugee camp. The Balata camp, established in 1950 and meant to be temporary, is now the largest Palestinian refugee camp in the West Bank, with approximately 30,000 residents living in an area of less than a tenth of a square mile. Finally, it was back to Tel Aviv for dinner and some beachfront time to reflect as the sun set over the Mediterranean before heading back to the airport for a midnight flight to New York. So thank you for watching, for allowing me to share a little of this experience with you. Maybe someday we'll meet for falafel on the rooftop of the St. George Hotel in East Jerusalem. Until then, peace.